Thank you, Mike. There's always a few gasps that I hear when they mention that I have 11 children. My wife and I have never been asked to teach NFP classes, ever, our entire life. Actually, in a couple of weeks, we'll celebrate our 33rd wedding anniversary, so it's amazing to me, especially given the theme I'll talk about tonight, why be Catholic. It's amazing to me how fast time goes by. Some of you here can relate to that. You've been married more than I have, longer than I have. And you know that time is a lot like sand. It slips through our fingers if we allow it to. So with that, I'd like to talk this evening about a subject very dear to my heart, why be Catholic. I myself am Catholic. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that we live in a time, certainly in a culture, where to publicly identify yourself as Catholic takes a bit of a risk. Because the Catholic Church is generally looked down upon. You see it mocked in the media, don't you? In television programs, movies, that kind of thing. The Catholic Church is not like the Bells of St. Mary's portrayal of 50 or 60 years ago, that the Catholic Church was held in high regard. And so, as I speak tonight on the subject of why be Catholic, I'd rather approach the topic from a personal standpoint, rather than suggest that I could tell any of you why you should be Catholic. I'd rather just speak from my own heart and tell you why I'm a Catholic, give you what my reasons are. And my hope is that some of the things that are important to me about being Catholic, maybe some of my own experiences growing up Catholic, might be useful to you in your discussion with others about why be Catholic. If I could just see a quick show of hands, how many of you know somebody who has left the Catholic Church? Everybody, basically. How many of you have ever been faced with a tough question about your Catholic faith and didn't have a good answer to that tough question? And how many of you don't like to be asked to raise your hands in public? Well, those first two questions obviously are serious because we all know people who have left the church. It could be a family member. Chances are it is a family member, maybe several family members. That's a very common tale. Catholic families all around the country are in stress because someone or more than one person in the family leaves the faith, and it causes tension and stress, especially around the holidays. And a lot of people would like to be able to reach out to those people who have left the church, but they're not really sure how. They don't really know what to say or how to get the point across without being argumentative or without things degenerating into a fight or a shouting match or something like that. That's partly what I work on in my duties as a Catholic radio host. How many of you have heard my radio program called Right Here, Right Now? Oh, good. Many of you. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking he sounds much taller on the radio, aren't you? Well, on the radio, I deal with these issues. I deal with them in books. I deal with them in lectures such as this one. But all of these different avenues of approach are designed to do one thing, and that is to give reasons for why people should take a look at the Catholic Church. Even those who have left the Catholic Church. Those who have turned their back on it and said, I don't want anything to do with it, even they deserve a good explanation and maybe a clearing up of some of the misconceptions that they had. One word for this work is called apologetics. And apologetics doesn't mean that I go around apologizing for being Catholic. Yeah, I'm sorry guys, I don't know what to tell you. I'm sorry, I'm Catholic. That is not apologetics. That would be an apology, but apologetics is giving a reasoned defense for what we believe. So when I'm asked, why am I Catholic, I do my best to try to give the salient reasons that are important to me for why I am Catholic. And let's face it, we live in a time when there are many options, right? There are many opportunities. You could be any religion you want. They would certainly be happy to take you in if you decided to go to that church. Maybe it's an Eastern religion. Maybe you want to satisfy yourself by saying, well, I'm going to be a good spiritual person. I don't have to be religious. I don't have to go to church on Sunday for that. I can just be a good person. There are many different options out there. So why be Catholic? Well, as I said a moment ago, there is a bit of a risk in identifying oneself publicly as Catholic. Let's imagine for a moment that this is a Catholics Anonymous meeting. Here we are all together. Oddly enough, instead of coffee in the back, there's beer. That's interesting. But it's my turn to speak, so I'm up in front of the group. Hi, everyone. I'm Pat.
Hi, Pat.
Thank you. Very good. I'm a Catholic. I admit it. And those of you who are saying, why did they say hi, Pat? You just ask somebody who said hi, Pat, and they'll explain to you. But it can be a bit embarrassing, wouldn't you say, to say that you're a Catholic in some quarters, because it can involve the risk, perhaps, of rejection, ridicule. People might think, oh gosh, why would you be Catholic when there's so many problems in the Catholic Church? I have a new book coming out in May of this year from Random House. It's called Why Be Catholic? And in the book I talk about an analogy between the Catholic Church and Noah's Ark. And I'd like to just talk about that for a moment. We all know the story of Noah's Ark. Imagine if you were Noah's neighbor and you see him building this big ark in the middle of a place that didn't need arks. There was no water there for them to float. And he's building this big ark, and you're wondering, why is he doing this? It seems rather comical, even ludicrous, that he would go to all this trouble to have this ark. And if you could picture yourself on the day that it started to rain, even before you realized how bad the rain was going to get, a lot of people would have looked at the ark and still have scoffed at it. But there were some, especially as the rain began to gather in intensity and more water came pouring down, there were some who began to realize, I'd like to actually get on that ark. I'd like to get in that ark so I can escape from the water. Well, I believe that the Catholic Church is very much like Noah's Ark. It's a very messy place. It is filled with commotion. We have just come through a 10, 15-year stretch of all the pre-scandals and other scandals related to them that have really shocked people and demoralized people. Many Catholics have felt very discouraged by that, and rightly so. But it's a lot like Noah's Ark. It's a messy place. Try to imagine getting a good night's sleep on Noah's Ark with all those animals. I don't think that would have been very easy. Some of those animals wanted to eat one another. They wanted to kill one another. And when I look at the Catholic Church, I realize that there are quite a few similarities. A lot of Catholics don't get along. But I would rather be on the ark with all the mess and the stench and the commotion and live through the flood rather than not be on the ark. I could choose to go body surfing if I wanted to, and I don't think I would make it very far. But in spite of the problems on the ark, that's where I want to be, because if I'm in the ark, I'm going to escape from the flood. That's what I believe as a Catholic. And although it's only a metaphor, it has helped me to see past many of the problems that exist in the Catholic Church that can, as they say, demoralize or cause discouragement. And we're all tempted in one way or another to those things. Why should I bother with this church with all the problems that it has? What I'd like to do is just lay out for you in the time that I have available some of the key reasons that I am personally Catholic. And I'll go all the way back to the earliest memory I've got. I was about 5 years old, and I remember discovering, much to my astonishment, really to my shock, that not everyone in the world was Catholic. And it was just really strange for me to imagine that other people didn't believe what I had been taught by my parents, that Jesus was present in the Eucharist, or that the Pope is the head of the church, or that Mary and the saints are in heaven praying for us, and all those things I had learned. As a kid, I had what we all had at one time, which was a childlike faith. I believed it because my parents told me it was true, and I had no reason to doubt them. I didn't demand biblical evidence from my father when he told me that Jesus was truly present in the Blessed Sacrament. I just accepted it, because why would he lie to me? These people love me, they're going to tell me the truth. So when I heard somehow that not everyone was Catholic, I was shocked. I didn't understand how they couldn't believe these things. I didn't understand them, but I believed them. And I was in the 4th grade. I'll never forget this incident. I was in the 4th grade, and I wanted to sit next to this cute girl in my class on a bus trip for a field trip we were taking that day. And I maneuvered myself in the line so I could sit next to her, and we were having a great conversation, and it seemed to be going well until she asked me what church I went to. And I said, I go to such and such a Catholic church. And the look on her face, I'll never forget, it was a look of kind of a mixture of disgust and horror. And she told the tale just by the look she gave me, and I said, well, what's wrong? She said, you're Catholic. I said, yes, what's wrong with that? And she said, well, Catholics are idol worshippers. And I didn't know what an idol worshiper was. I had never heard the term before, but I immediately said, no, we're not. What's an idol worshiper? And she went on to describe what they were teaching in her church, and that is that Catholics offend against what the Bible says in Exodus chapter 20, beginning of verse 2, where God says to Moses, do not carve any graven images of anything on the earth beneath. Don't carve images of anything in the sky or in the waters beneath the earth. Do not bow down before them and worship them. And apparently, whatever church this girl went to, they were teaching from the Bible that Catholics were idol worshippers because we have statues of Jesus and Mary, we have crucifixes, and you can go into any Catholic church and you'll see these things. You might even see votive lights in front of the statues. And that, in her church, was tantamount to idolatry. We were blaspheming God by worshiping these statues. Now, I didn't know any of this. I never heard of it. But I knew as I was sitting there on the bus thinking this through, I remember thinking to myself, I've never seen my parents worship a statue. I've never worshipped a statue. I've never even heard of worshiping a statue. It just seems so ridiculous to me. But she insisted that this was the case. So I didn't have any answers. There's really nothing more I could say. And that was the end of that relationship opportunity for me and this girl. That's pretty much where everything ended. But I never forgot the experience. And later on, years later, I remember as I was delving into this subject more deeply, what I discovered was, yes, in Exodus 20, God does say, do not carve graven images, do not bow down before them and worship them. But just 5 chapters later, in Exodus chapter 25, God there tells Moses to carve graven images. Now, I'm sure, for those of you who haven't read the book of Exodus lately, I'm sure all of you have seen the movie Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. And in that movie, you remember the Hollywood depiction of the ark. It's this container, and it had 2 angels sitting on top of it by God's command, that they would be fashioned out of gold and they would be placed in a certain way. So they were clearly religious statues that were designated to show how holy the ark was. And I reasoned my way through that, and I thought, well, God is not forgetful. He didn't forget that he told Moses, no graven images, and then suddenly, okay, now carve some graven images. So I realized that it couldn't be that God was condemning graven images per se. Otherwise, he's caught in a contradiction. And the more I studied it, the more I found that there are plenty of places in the Old Testament where God either approves of statues or he commands statues. There in Exodus 25, or in the book of Numbers, where he commands that Moses would fashion the statue of a snake and put it on a pole, so that when people who were being bitten by poisonous serpents would see the snake, they would be healed miraculously. And all of us are familiar with that symbol for the medical profession, a pole with a snake on it. That's where it comes from. So the more I began to study these things, the more I realized, no, it's not idolatry to have a graven image. We have graven images in the Catholic Church for the same reason that we have pictures of our wives or our children. If you saw me kiss a picture of my wife, you wouldn't be alarmed and think, oh my gosh, what an idiot. He loves Kodak paper. What's wrong with him? You would know that it's the woman represented by the Kodak paper. It's not the paper itself. And in the same way, the wood, the plaster, the metal in themselves are irrelevant, inconsequential. It's who they depict for us. People who really do exist, we can't see them with our physical eyes. It's like family photographs. But I didn't know any of that information when I was talking to this girl, so I was dead in the water. I had nothing else I could say. Years later, when I was speaking at a parish in Chicago, I pulled up in front of the rectory with a colleague of mine, and there on the front lawn were 3 large statues of Our Lady of Fatima, and then 3 statues of the children of Fatima, kneeling in front of that statue with their hands folded in prayer. And I turned to my colleague and I said, what a great religion the Catholic Church is. Not only can we worship statues, but our statues can worship statues. And I thought, that's pretty clever. And I told the story that night to the audience there, and they chuckled just like you did, but there were a few people in the audience who didn't chuckle. I found out why during the Q&A session, and that's because they were the non-Catholic folk, one of whom was a minister of the local Bible church. And he said, why are you Catholics laughing about that? Because we know you do worship statues. So it was an opportunity for me to walk through some of that evidence that I had accumulated. Now this really began to start getting on me in terms of challenges to my Catholic faith when I was in my golden summer. I look back on this as my golden summer. Probably every one of you has a golden summer back in your past. For me, it was the summer between my junior and senior years of high school. Now I grew up in Southern California, Orange County to be exact, if you're familiar with the area. And it's idyllic. I mean, it's, when we're up in Ohio shivering with 15-degree weather, and I look on my iPhone and I see that my hometown in Orange County is sunny and 75, sometimes I wonder why we moved to Ohio. But the main thing is, in Southern California, there were so many fun things to do. We had Disneyland, the beach, so many fun things. But what made it especially fun for me that summer was I had recently gotten my driver's license, so I had some mobility, and I was dating this really cute Protestant girl named Christy. And it was just fun in the sun all summer long, except I had to pay a price for going out with this girl. And that was whenever I would go to Christy's house, her dad would sit down with me in the living room, and he would get out his big King James Bible, and he would grill me mercilessly for, to me, what seemed like hours. It was probably only 15 or 20 minutes, but it seemed like forever. And we would sit in the living room, and before I could take Christy and go, roller skating or go get pizza, he would say, well, now, Pat, it says here, and he would turn, for example, to Matthew chapter 23, verse 9, and he would read the passage where Jesus says, "Call no one on earth Father, for you have but one Father who is in heaven." And he said, now, Jesus in the Bible says, "Call no one on earth Father." Tell me, Pat, what do you call priests in the Catholic Church? Oh, we call them Father. And he would say, well, doesn't it bother you that your church does something that the Bible says not to do? And here again, I didn't know how to answer this question. I didn't know all the good, solid answers from the New Testament about why we call priests Father. Maybe during the Q&A session I can touch upon that briefly. But I was a sitting duck. I didn't know what to say. And he would go from subject to subject, challenging my Catholic faith. And quite frankly, as I look back on it, it was a pretty dicey time for me. Because although I was raised in the Catholic faith, and my mom and dad brought us to Mass every Sunday, and we went to confession frequently, we prayed the rosary as a family, most nights, if not every night. Nonetheless, he was asking questions I couldn't answer, and I didn't know if there were answers to those questions, which deep down inside was probably what worried me the most. I was thinking, what if he's right? What if my mom and dad were not lying to me, but what if what they were telling me just isn't true? And maybe, to my horror, I started thinking maybe some of this actually might be right, and that called into question really my whole identity, because I had been raised to understand my Catholic faith as an identity, not something I did for an hour a week on Sunday. And my parents did something right. I'm the oldest of 8 kids. They're all adults in the middle age. And of all the 8 kids, all 8 kids are still Catholic. It's an amazing thing in today's world. I'm still trying to figure out what exactly they did, because I want to do the same thing for all of my children. The younger ones have no choice. They're Catholic because I say so. But when they get out of the house, as the older ones have done, they have to make the decision on their own. Which is what happened to me that golden summer, because going to Christy's house, she was like the bait on the hook. And I sometimes wonder, looking back on it, if maybe this was like a missionary dating situation, where her father was intentionally allowing me to date this girl in hopes that he would be able to reel me in like a fish and get me out of the Catholic Church. And he told me many times, he said, your church is not even Christian. He said, you need to be born again. You have a different Jesus, a different gospel. You are not saved. You are not going to heaven, and you won't unless you become a true born-again Christian. So I was dealing with that all summer long. And what happened was, over the course of the summer, every time Christy's dad would give me a challenge, I'd go home. One time he gave me a Bible tract. You may have seen these little fundamentalist comic book tracts. This one was called The Death Cookie. It was against the Eucharist. It had a picture of a skull and crossbones on top of a host on the front cover. And he really believed the stuff in this little tract. He said, you need to read this because this will show you why your belief in Jesus in the wafer, he called it. He also called it a cookie. He said, you believe that God is in the cookie. This is anti-biblical. Read this, it'll explain why. So I'd go home and I'd say to my dad, okay, Dad, here's the latest thing. The death cookie. What do I do with this? And my mom and dad, they were very wise. They had a large library of good Catholic books in our home. Catholic Encyclopedia, they had a lot of other reference books and books on apologetics. So it was very helpful to me that I was able to go there and get answers to the questions that were being asked of me. And so my dad wouldn't find the answers for me. He knew what they were, but he wanted me to find them for myself. So he wisely said, all right, the answer to that question is in this book here. You take the book down and say, it's a real good book. I remember one set of volumes we had was called Radio Replies. And maybe some of you, Father, remember those, and some of you might remember Radio Replies. They were like the classic apologetics books of the 20s and 30s. And practically any question that you could think of against the Catholic Church was answered very succinctly, very powerfully in these books. So what was weird was that I would come home with stuff like the death cookie, or call no man father, or some argument against Mary. And I'd find these arguments answered profoundly and compellingly in these books, and they had been answered 40 years earlier. So I thought, not only is this a good answer, but this is nothing new. That really impressed me. I realized these arguments that I'm getting is new to me, but it's certainly not new to the Catholic Church. These are not like stumpers. The Catholic Church had never heard of these things before. And so over time, my confidence level got better and better. I became more and more certain of my beliefs. And by the time we got to the end of the summer, I realized that I was the fish that was going to get away. Because at this point now, Christy's dad's arguments no longer had any kind of power over me. I didn't doubt anymore. Now I figured maybe there are other arguments I'll have to meet down the road, and I'll get to those whenever they happen. But for the moment at least, these arguments fell flat. So in a strange but blessed kind of way, I was just trying to date this girl. But her father turned me into a better Catholic as he was trying to get me out of the Catholic Church. And I didn't understand what was happening at the time, but if I ever see her on Facebook, or if she ever friends me on Facebook, I don't think I want to tell her that her father is actually partly responsible for the work that I do. I think his hair would catch on fire if he found out that happened. I think it's exactly the opposite effect that he was hoping to have. But that set me on a lifetime quest from that point forward of saying to myself, all right, if the Catholic Church is true, then no matter how potent or seemingly plausible the argument against it might be, there will be an answer. And if there's no answer to it, if it turns out that I've been duped unwittingly by my loving parents, if I've been duped by good people that I grew up with, people that I loved, who themselves have been duped, fair enough, I'll leave the Catholic Church. And I wanted to find the toughest arguments I could find, from atheists, from Bible-believing non-Catholics. I talked to Muslims, Hindus. I talked to anyone I could. It was kind of a hobby for me, because I thought, give me your best argument against the Catholic Church. I want to see if there's any merit to it. And time after time, what I discovered, and this to me is one of those huge bullet points, I found that I couldn't crack that case. I couldn't disprove these teachings on the Eucharist or whatever it might be. And I wanted to be as honest with myself as at all possible, so I searched high and low, and I came away time after time feeling, not that I was vindicated, because I'm not important, but the truths of the Catholic faith I saw vindicated biblically, historically. I'll give you an example. When I got into the world of apologetics, it's getting close to 30 years ago now, and very quickly, when there's a Catholic, it's kind of like whack-a-mole. When a Catholic pops his head up and he starts defending the faith, there are plenty of people there with mallets to whack that head down again. And so one of the things that I worked at Catholic Answers in the early days. I was there for 8 years. And one of the things that we commonly received were challenges to debate publicly with, for example, Protestant ministers. So I had about a dozen public debates, formal debates. The biggest one I ever was in was in front of 1,600 people. We have 220 men here tonight? Imagine this multiplied 8 times. And that was the size of the audience. I was petrified when I got there, because I had to debate salvation and going by the Bible alone. And when I got there must have been over 1,000 people an hour before the debate. I asked the organizers, when it was about 5 minutes before the debate, there were about 1,600 people there, they said. I asked, how many do you think are Catholic? And they said, well, maybe 200. So that told me that fully 1,200 to 1,400 people there that evening were definitely not there to root for me. They were rooting for the other team. And I mean, there were banks of lights, and there were microphones and video cameras, and I definitely got a little taste of what Daniel must have felt like when he went into the lion's den. I was very nervous about this whole debate. But this is the thing that happened in that debate and in so many other debates that I've been in spite of my own deficiencies as a debater, and I have plenty of them. I listen to it. I don't even like to listen to my debates later, because I think to myself, oh, I should have said this, or I forgot this verse, I could have said this, or why didn't I say it this way? I mean, woulda, coulda, shoulda. But time after time, in spite of my flaws as a debater, and in fact, in spite of the erudition or the rhetorical prowess or the persuasive way of explaining something that the Protestant ministers, for example, would have, and I mean Baptist ministers, Lutherans, Calvinists, etc. In spite of all those things, what would happen is after these debates were over, people would convert to the Catholic Church. And I knew it couldn't have been because of me. I realized that this is the gravitational pull exerted by the truth. It has a gravitational pull all its own. It pulled me. And I discovered the truth of what Archbishop Fulton Sheen had said so often, and that is that the Catholic Church, or more specifically the truth of the Catholic Church, is like a lion. Lions don't need to be defended. All they need is to be let out of their cages and they'll defend themselves. And so in my case, what I saw was that when the Catholic faith on the teachings on whatever it might be, the Eucharist or Mary or whatever, when they're simply explained and when they're given a biblical context and there's evidence furnished for them and they're explained in a coherent way, they have power in themselves to draw people because, and here's that bullet point, because as I came to be convinced, they're true. They hang together biblically. And in spite of the fiery oratory or the clever arguments that a Baptist minister might pull out in arguing against some Catholic teaching, what I found was that time after time, at least to my satisfaction, and I found to the satisfaction of others who were either at the debates or who heard the CDs of the debates later, even those rhetorical elements were not sufficient to obscure the fact that these teachings are actually true. So that's a big reason for me. I came to believe that they're true. Under fire, under the harshest of scrutinies. I remember that debate I told you about a second ago, 1,600 people. When it was over, my wife and I were walking to the car. I was like a wrung-out dish rag. I was just tired, mentally, physically, and I just wanted to go home. And as we're walking to the car, a young woman came up to us and introduced herself. And she said, I'm an evangelical Protestant, I'm a Calvinist, and I was raised believing all the things that I heard said in the debate about the Catholic Church. She said, I have grown up believing the Catholic Church is the whore of Babylon, not a Christian religion. And she said, I brought a bunch of my Catholic friends to this debate because I wanted them to see that the Catholic Church was a false church. And she said, the weirdest thing is that after this debate, I realized I had never heard the Catholic response to all of my arguments. And furthermore, I had never heard the Catholic critique of my positions, as I did in this debate. She said, I feel really weird now because I really think God is telling me I may have to become Catholic. And I know my parents are going to flip out, and I just, could use a little moral support. So I gave her my business card and we stayed in touch. Her name is Annie McCard. That was her maiden name. Her name now is Annie Witz. And the reason I mentioned that is because she's a for real person. We're still in contact on Facebook now, and she will periodically send me a note and say, oh, by the way, I gave CDs of that debate to this Baptist minister that I met at the grocery store. Guess what? He's in RCIA. He's coming into the Catholic Church for Easter Vigil. It's happened enough times that I just say, well, thanks be to God. I can't account for it any other way. Another reason that I'm Catholic when I could be anything else is for the historical force of the Catholic case. And what I mean by that is, I become convinced that the Catholic Church is the church that Christ established. Now, here's what I mean by that. There is good in other religions. The Catholic Church emphasizes that. We acknowledge and we respect and we're grateful for the truth and the goodness that exists in other religions. And I don't want to in any way diminish that fact. An analogy that has been helpful to me is to picture a mirror, a highly polished, beautiful mirror that can reflect the rays of the sun completely as the sun beams down on that mirror. I liken that to the Catholic Church. I'm not talking about Catholics. We have bad Catholics and good Catholics, mediocre Catholics. I'm talking about the truth of the doctrines itself and this church as the church that Christ established as an entity. So that mirror to me is sort of symbolic of the Catholic Church. Now imagine a mirror, not the same mirror, but another mirror that has been broken. So now you've got shards of the mirror on the ground. You can pick up a piece of the mirror and it's going to reflect the light. You'll see the light reflected in it. Some pieces that are bigger can reflect more light, some less. But that to me is analogous to the fact that truth, which is like the light, can be reflected in other ways. So I don't feel at all threatened when I meet people who are not Catholic and yet who have a lot of goodness or a lot of truth or a lot of wisdom, whatever it may be. My message to them is not, hey, I'm better than you, because chances are I'm not. But rather, I have something that I want you to have. I have the fullness of the Catholic faith, and I don't deserve to have this. It was given to me. I was raised in a Catholic family. I didn't have to lift a finger to get this great gift. And quite frankly, I don't know if this is true of any of you, but quite frankly, there were any number of years that I took my Catholic faith for granted. I mean, I went to Mass on Sunday, but I went through periods of lukewarmness and drifting away, not from my beliefs. I always believe these things. But you know how it is when you get caught up in things of the world and you start rationalizing and you start compartmentalizing and you say, well, yeah, I'm Catholic, I'm going to go to church on Sunday and all that, but I'm also going to sort of drift into these areas over here that I really shouldn't be in. We're masters at self-deception. It happens frequently. So for me, personally, even though I went through times like that in my younger years, I realized this church is the church that Christ established. And here's some of the ways that became impressed upon me. The argument that I find the most powerful is this historical argument I alluded to a moment ago. You all have heard the name John Henry Newman, Blessed John Henry Newman. He was a famous convert from Anglicanism in the 19th century. In fact, he was a bitter anti-Catholic polemicist for some years before he started evolving toward the Catholic Church. And he wanted to write a book that would thoroughly disprove the Catholic Church's teachings on things like the Mass and Purgatory and the Pope. And so he set about writing what would become, he hoped, the classic refutation of Catholic teaching in favor of the Anglican Church. And he was a profoundly intellectual man. He was a genius. And he had all the intellectual tools at his disposal to be able to do this job. And everyone was cheering him on. This is going to be great. You're going to finally answer the Church of Rome and all of her errors. Well, John Henry Newman got only so far into the process of researching and writing this book, and he threw up his hands in exasperation, and he converted to the Catholic Church. And the book wound up becoming something that he didn't intend. The book wound up becoming an essay on the development of Christian doctrine, in which he actually said, I started off trying to disprove all this. Now I'm going to write to show that it is true, and here's why. And on page 8 of the edition that I have, it's at the very beginning, he says, these are his words, he says, to become deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. Now, he didn't intend any disrespect to Protestant folk, nor do I. I have respect for them, and I want to be friends with them. I have nothing but goodwill toward any Protestant person. But the phenomenon of Protestantism as such, as a phenomenon religiously speaking, he got to the point where he realized there is no way to account for the fact that the Catholic Church can be shown to be present in every generation from the present all the way back to the time of Christ and the Apostles. And if you consider, for example, clues in the Gospel of St. Matthew, for example, in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, you are the light of the world. Remember that one? No one lights a lamp and puts it under a bushel basket, but rather it's put on a stand where it gives light to everyone in the house. That's good advice. You have a dark house, you light a lamp, you don't cover it. And Jesus, of course, wouldn't give us advice that he himself wouldn't take. I realized as I thought about that, I thought, well, whatever church this is that Jesus established, it's got to be visible. No one lights a lamp and then hides it. So Jesus didn't go to all the trouble of establishing a church, but yet making it so obscure and arcane that nobody could ever really know if he had ever found it. What good would that be? Besides, Jesus never did things that way. He always did things for the full effect. I saw that Jesus said in Matthew 16, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So I figured, well, that means that whatever church is the true church must be able to trace itself back to Christ himself. It could not have been started by a man or a woman some point down the road. It has to be able to go right back to Jesus. And then I saw at the end of Matthew's Gospel where he says in chapter 28, he says to the apostles, go into the whole world, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And then he finishes by saying, and behold, I am with you always, even until the end of the world. So for me, I reason to myself, well, that means that if Jesus, who is God, makes a promise that he will be with this church until the end of the world, then that means that the church can never fall away. It can never defect. It can never corrupt. It can never apostatize entirely. It would have to be in existence and visible all the way to the end of the world. And since we're not at the end of the world yet, I can just start today and work my way backward, which is kind of what John Henry Newman did. If you go back 200 years ago, in the year 1814, you'll find the Catholic Church. There it is. The Pope, the bishops, it's visible. It's also visible because of the sacraments, right? Because of the doctrines about Mary and the Mass and purgatory. No one's going to confuse those doctrines with Good Book Baptist or, the Lutheran church down the street. Those are distinctively Catholic doctrines. Wouldn't you agree with that? So, I reasoned this way. I thought, well, if I go back far enough, let me see what happens. In the year 1814, there's the Catholic Church, but you know what didn't exist in the year 1814? The Mormon Church. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints didn't exist. Joseph Smith was still a kid. And he didn't claim that he had restored the church that had been lost through apostasy until much later. There were no Jehovah's Witnesses in 1814. There were no Seventh-day Adventists. There were no Christian Scientists. There were no non-denominational denominations, no Calvary Chapel. None of these groups existed because the men and the women that would start these religious movements had either not yet been born or hadn't started down those paths. Go back another 300 years, and there you are in 1514. And there you'll find the Catholic Church, and it was messy in 1514, pre-scandals, saints and sinners, people not getting along, It was very much similar to how we are today. In fact, that actually I find very encouraging because it tells me that the Catholic Church, among other things, must be divinely established by Christ, because if it were not, if it were simply just us Catholics, we would have destroyed ourselves and destroyed the church over and over again over the centuries. And yet this Catholic Church just continues to go forward like the Energizer Bunny, just keeps going and going and going, in spite of us Catholics, actually. But in the year 1514, I realized, wow, Martin Luther was still a Catholic priest. He hadn't left the Catholic Church yet. It would happen soon, but he hadn't left yet. There were no Calvinists, there were no Methodists, there were no Baptists, there were no Lutherans. None of these groups existed, but the Catholic Church was there. And then as I started going back, and I won't belabor the point, but simply to say that as I went back century by century, all the way back to the first century when Christ and the apostles were there, I could not find the Catholic Church in every generation. The Pope, the bishops, the doctrines. And for me that was huge, because by the time I get back to like the third, the second, the first century, and I'm encountering the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, I'm encountering the Mass, I'm encountering the authority of the Bishop of Rome, I'm encountering the reverence for the saints, prayers for the dead, and so forth. I just realized, let me add one other thing. I'm encountering that by the end of the first century, these earliest Christians are calling themselves Catholic to differentiate themselves from those groups that might be veering off away from what the apostles taught. For example, St. Ignatius of Antioch, who was a protege of St. John. St. John, of course, was in the upper room with Jesus at the Last Supper. He saw what was said. He knew what Jesus meant. And he discipled this man named Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius may well have known St. Peter also. But in any case, he received directly from an apostle the teaching of Christ about what happened at the Last Supper. And so in a couple of places, I'll conflate them. Ignatius says, if you meet somebody who does not confess what we believe in the Catholic Church, that the Eucharist is the flesh of Jesus that suffered for our salvation, that it's really him, he said, then avoid that person, because he's teaching something that did not come from the apostles. And he would know because he was discipled by an apostle. So for me, these things I couldn't overcome them. And the only possible option would be that this true church that Christ established vanished immediately, even while the apostles were still alive. And for me, that was just too far-fetched to be even possible, to be plausible, much less possible. I'm Catholic when I can be anything else because of the teachings of the Catholic Church. So, for example, the teachings on salvation, on authority, on the Eucharist, on Mary. As I've studied these teachings, I've come to see how really not just true they are, but how wonderful they are. Let me give you an example. Let's just talk about the Eucharist. I don't have a lot of time left, but I'd like to touch on that for a moment, if I may. The Holy Eucharist, as I grew up believing as a kid, probably the same for all of you or most of you, the Holy Eucharist is Jesus Christ, truly present, body, blood, soul, and divinity, under the appearances of bread and wine. And that's a formula that we all say, and when we think about it, what it means is that your sight and your touch and your sense of taste, all of your senses can only apprehend, they can only touch the physical characteristics of bread and wine. They can't perceive the reality or the essence or the substance of the bread and wine. But we believe as Catholics that Jesus is truly present. And for me, this is one of those deal breakers. I look at it this way. Tell me what you think. If the Catholic Church is wrong about this, then really who cares whatever else it might be right about? Because if it's wrong about the Eucharist, then we are idolaters, aren't we? We are worshiping a piece of bread. When the priest raises the host at Mass and you silently in your heart or under your breath in a whisper say, "My Lord and my God," or some other prayer of love for the Lord at the Mass, you are a blasphemer. You are an idolater if that's not really Jesus. That's my calculus. That's how I look at it, and I don't see any other option. If he's not there, then I say let's all go home and forget about the Catholic Church, because it's a deception of the worst kind. But on the other hand, if the Catholic Church is correct, if this really is Jesus present under the appearance of bread and wine, then for me personally, here's my calculus. I say, then I must be Catholic. There's no other option but to be in that church where Jesus Christ is truly present. And furthermore, I have an obligation to tell everyone I can why they should be Catholic too. Or at least I should make them aware of this precious gift that we have that, quite frankly, so many of us Catholics take for granted. Because if Jesus is truly here with us and he wants those graces to be in us, and he wants us to have the most personal relations with him, and that is to receive him into our very bodies when we go up to receive Holy Communion, then for me, all bets are off. Everyone should be Catholic. That's how I look at it. Why wouldn't you want to be Catholic if that's really God in Holy Communion? Now, I'll offer you another little angle here before I wrap things up. I like analogies, so try this one on for size. I think that the church is like an orchestra. Now, we have all seen orchestras, we've all heard orchestras. You know what an orchestra is. It's a large ensemble of trained musicians, and they gather together to play music to an audience. Now, Jesus is the founder of the church, and he can be likened to the founder of an orchestra. Now, try to imagine how weird it would be if somebody established an orchestra, gathered all these highly skilled musicians together, and he establishes this orchestra, but he doesn't give them any instruments. And he says, what I want you to do now is I want you to go around visiting cities and towns, gathering in concert halls, pack the place everywhere you go, and I want you to describe music to the people who show up. I want you to tell them what music sounds like. Describe it for them. Read about music to them. Here's a book about music. I want you to read about it to them. Tell them what it would be like if they could hear music. So you talk about it, you describe it, you think about it, all these things. And that would be weird, wouldn't it? That would be totally self-defeating, because that's not the purpose of an orchestra. The purpose of an orchestra is to make music. And I think of it this way. I think that the reason that we in the Catholic Church have the Mass and the sacraments is because Jesus didn't want his church simply to go around talking about him. He wants that, yes. He doesn't want us just reading about him or hearing nice stories about him or sermons about him. He doesn't want us just thinking about him. He doesn't want us just wondering what would it be like to have Jesus in our midst. He actually gives us himself in the Holy Eucharist. So for me, that's like giving the orchestra instruments. And it makes all the difference. Because now When we go into the world, we're not telling people about music, we're playing music for them. We're giving them the very thing that an orchestra is intended to do. There's so many reasons. I wish there were time, but there's not. I would draw your attention to the table over here. I've written books trying to explain these points in greater detail. I'll mention a few words about them in a few minutes, but let me just summarize things this way in hopes that maybe these reasons that we've talked about tonight and all the other ones that there haven't been time to talk about, that they will be, as I said, useful to you, something helpful to you in your own efforts to talk about the faith. Even if it's just, in a quiet way with a family member, someone who's left the Catholic Church, someone you know, maybe your own son or daughter. There are a lot of families, as you well know, where mom and dad raised the kids in the faith, brought them to Mass on Sunday, scrounged for the money to put them into Catholic school, only to see them leave the Catholic Church when they got into college. It's probably happened to some of you. And you may be sitting there thinking, what can I do? How can I help them come home? I think the very first answer to that question, and there are some really good practical things you can do, but the very first one is you got to start talking about it. Talk about it in the way you explain it to them verbally, but also in the way you show it to them. Let that light of Jesus, as Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, let that light shine before others so that they may see these good works and give glory to the Father who is in heaven. One of the things, actually I'm going to take it this way, 3 of the things that we need to do, I think, as men especially, is we have to be willing to live the truth, number one, because after all, if you're not living the truth, it doesn't really matter what you say, right? I mean, we all know a phony a mile away. He says one thing, he does another. He's leading a double life. He talks a great game, but when you get right down to it, he doesn't really follow through in the way he lives his life. We've seen these things, we've heard the stories. And all of us are quite capable of falling into this ourselves if we're not careful, if we don't stay close to Jesus. But I think we have to live the truth in a way that others can see, not to be ostentatious or showy, but to be real, to be genuine, and to say, I don't just talk about this, or I don't just go for an hour a week on Sunday. I believe this. And personally speaking, if the Catholic Church is not worth living for, it's not worth dying for. And quite frankly, I think that we're heading into a storm, not away from a storm. I sense that there are rough waters and dark days ahead, maybe nearer than we think, in which being a Catholic in the modern world could become a dangerous thing. It's happened before. It's happening right now in other parts of the world. And as the Lord himself said, I think about these words all the time. I think about how many ways that I personally have fallen short of this. But what did he say? He said, if you are faithful in little things, you'll be faithful in big things. If you're unfaithful in little things, you'll be unfaithful in big things. To me, the biggest thing possible is someone puts a gun to my head and says, you either renounce Christ or boom, you're dead. That's about as big as it gets. And if things trend in the direction it seems that they're going, maybe it's not a gun to my head, maybe it's a fine, maybe it's a jail sentence for being Catholic. Cardinal George of Chicago, he's not the kind of guy to mess around. He publicly said these words. He said, I expect to die in my bed. I expect my successor, the next Archbishop of Chicago, to die in prison. And I expect his successor to die a martyr. So those words really wake me up when I think about how not being afraid to live my Catholic faith is not just an option. I have to do that. Because if I'm not faithful in those little things, then when the real tests come my way, I'll probably fall apart. And I don't want that to happen. Second thing, we have to not be afraid to speak the truth. That's a no-brainer. We speak it in a certain sense the way we live it, but speaking it verbally, don't be afraid to talk about your Catholic faith. You may find people ridicule you or turn their backs on you or whatever it may be, but that's okay. You don't know what God's grace is doing in the mind and the heart of that other person. And it might well be that at first it seems like you have to suffer a little bit of loss for going to that trouble, but that's all that was needed to help this other person the rest of the way home. My wife taught me a really great lesson about this. When our 11th child was born, Nancy and I wanted to get away for a quiet dinner, away from all the din of the kids in the house. And we decided to go to the local Olive Garden. So we packed up our newborn baby, we got in our minivan, we drove to the Olive Garden, got seated at our booth, the waitress gave us the menus, and immediately, because women are maternal, she starts asking my wife, how old's the baby, boy or girl, you know, all the standard questions. Then she asked my wife the question that neither Nancy nor I wanted her to ask us, because we've been asked this question before. She says, very innocently to Nancy, she says, is he your first? Now, my wife, God bless her, I'm very proud of her. She's slim, she's very youthful, she's definitely kept her figure after 11 children. You never know she'd had 11 children. So when the waitress said, is he your first? Nancy looks at me across the table, and with her eyes, she says, do you want to answer that one? I shook my head, no, you go ahead and answer that. So she said to the waitress, she said, no, he's our 11th. Now we knew what was coming next, and it happened. Your 11th child, this woman just didn't know how to act. I mean, 11 children, and she was so amazed and shocked and probably, really puzzled. Why would you have 11 children? She ran off and got 3 or 4 other waitresses, brought them to our table. Try to picture the scene. I'm here, Nancy's here, and these waitresses are crowding around it and looking at us and asking questions like, why would you have 11 kids? And they're looking at Nancy with expressions of pity. You poor woman, 11 children. And they're looking at me like, you monster, what's wrong with you? Keeping your wife pregnant and barefoot all these years. And so we're kind of used to it, so we're just sitting there, putting up with it. And then what happened was the waitresses started talking about their own contraceptive habits. So one of them says, well, 2 kids, that's enough for me. I'm on the pill now. And the other one sort of chuckled and she said, yeah, well, after our 2 kids, I made my husband have a vasectomy. And the other one said, well, I got my tubes tied. I'm sitting at the table thinking to myself, I just want to have a plate of lasagna. I don't want to hear all this information, especially as I'm about to eat dinner. And in the midst of all this negativity, my lovely wife smiles at these ladies and just in a very quiet, calm voice, she said, well, my husband and I believe that children are a blessing from God. And we believe in being open to life so that God can bless our marriage. But that's all she said, just like that, in that tone of a voice. But it was like putting water on a campfire. And the waitresses left, they went back to their work. We finished our meal, paid the bill. And as we were getting into our car, out in the parking lot, I heard footsteps running up behind us. I turned around, it was our waitress. And under the street light above, and every time I drive by this Olive Garden, I think about what happened next. She said, I didn't want you to leave without saying thank you. And she had run all the way down to the parking lot to get to us to say this. And I knew she wasn't talking to me because I didn't leave that big of a tip. So clearly she was speaking to Nancy. She said, I didn't want you to leave without saying thank you. She said, what you said in there really stirred my heart. She said, I realized all of a sudden that what you said is true. I'm on the pill, she said. But she said, I want God to bless my marriage, and I'm going home tonight. I'm telling my husband I'm getting off the pill. I don't know how he's going to react. He's probably going to get mad. But I want God to bless my marriage, and I didn't want you to leave without saying thank you. So she gave Nancy a hug, and she went back in the restaurant. We've never seen her again. But I have to imagine that gentle response, gently speaking the truth, will pay huge dividends in the life of that family. And who knows, maybe someone will come up to my wife in heaven and say, you don't know me, but you met my mom at the Olive Garden. And I'm here because of what you said. So I'm going to leave you with 2 final things in my waning couple of minutes before my time is up here. The first thing is, I'd like to read you a very brief, true story. This story was written by a man named Greg O'Leary. It's in a book called Small Miracles. I'm just going to read you 2 or 3 paragraphs, but you'll get the sense of what I'm driving at here. When I say why be Catholic, one of the reasons is because we have a culture to save, starting with our own families. And it requires action, it requires bravery, it requires all the manly virtues that Christ wants us to model in Him. So listen to this true story and draw your own conclusions. Personally, I think this is a good reminder that we can't sit by and not live the faith and not speak about the faith. We have to take action. I was walking down a dimly lit street late one evening when I heard muffled screams, and I heard muffled screams coming from behind a clump of trees. Alarmed, I slowed down to listen and panicked when I realized that what I was hearing were the unmistakable sounds of a struggle. Heaving, grunting, frantic scuffling, the tearing of fabric. I realized that only yards from where I stood, a woman was being attacked. Should I get involved? I asked myself. I was frightened for my own safety, and I cursed myself for having decided suddenly to take a new route home that night. What if I became a victim? Shouldn't I just run and call the police and let them take care of him? Although it seemed like an eternity, the deliberations in my mind had only taken seconds, but already the girl's cries were growing weaker. I knew I had to act fast. How could I walk away from this? No, I finally resolved I could not turn my back on the fate of this unknown woman, even if it meant risking my own life. I am not a brave man, nor am I athletic. I don't know where I found the moral courage and the physical strength, but once I had finally resolved to help the girl, I became strangely transformed. I ran behind the bushes, grabbed the assailant, and pulled him off the woman. Grappling and punching, we fell to the ground where we struggled for a few moments until the attacker jumped up and escaped. Panting hard, I scrambled upright and approached the girl who was crouched behind a tree, sobbing in the darkness. I could barely see her outline, but I could certainly sense her trembling shock. Not wanting to frighten her further, I first spoke to her from a distance and said soothingly, "It's okay. The man ran away. You're safe now." There was a long pause, and then I heard her words uttered in wonder and amazement. "Dad, is that you?" And then from behind the tree stepped my youngest daughter, Catherine. Greg O'Leary is the author. Small Miracles is the book. And when I contemplate, it's just tough to read that story because I just imagine, A, what would I do? And B, what would happen if I didn't do something? What would have happened to his daughter if he hadn't taken action? I think that's really a great analogy for what we're up against. We have to take action. So I'll leave you with this. It's called the Fellowship of the Unashamed. I see this as kind of like our marching orders, our battle plan, our plan of action as Catholic men. I didn't write this. I wish I had written it. I don't know who wrote it. But listen to this. This is our mission statement. I'm a part of the Fellowship of the Unashamed. The die has been cast. The decision has been made. I have stepped over the line. I won't look back, let up, slow down, back away, or be still. My past is redeemed. My present makes sense, and my future is in God's hands. I am finished and done with low living, small planning, the bare minimum, smooth knees, mundane talking, frivolous living, selfish giving, and dwarf goals. I no longer need preeminence, prosperity, position, promotions, applause, or popularity. I don't have to be right, first, the best, recognized, praised, regarded, or rewarded. I now live by faith. I lean on Christ's presence. I love with patience, live by prayer, and labor with the power of God's grace. My face is set, my gait is fast, my goal is heaven. My road is narrow, my way is rough, my companions are few. My guide is reliable, and my mission is clear. I cannot be bought, compromised, detoured, lured away, turned back, deluded, or delayed. I will not flinch in the face of sacrifice, hesitate in the presence of adversity, negotiate at the table of the enemy, ponder at the pool of popularity, or meander in the maze of mediocrity. I won't give up, shut up, let up, or slow up until I have stayed up, stored up, prayed up, paid up, and spoken up for the cause of Christ. I'm a disciple of Jesus. I'm a Catholic. I must go until he comes, give until I drop, speak out until all know, and work until he stops me. And when he returns for his own, he will have no difficulty recognizing me, for my banner is clear. I am a part of the Fellowship of the Unashamed. Thank you very much, brothers. God bless you.